decided to invert the order today. I think it's important that I get through the review to make sure that we have enough time to do that first. And then after the review, we should have plenty of time for at least the 5 of you so far that have signed up. And if anybody else wants to go, that would be great as well. So interestingly, we only have 21 people. So I think there's actually 28 in the class if we add them both together. So, all right. See, I'm going to just go ahead and start the review. I do want to say that I'm going to upload everything tomorrow. So, you know, the recording of this session as well as, and by the way, I won't record the oral presentations. So I'm going to upload the PDF document as well as the video of the lecture, as well as the previous 2 lectures as a PDF. So it'll all be available to you by tomorrow afternoon or so. So it's a beautiful day outside, huh? Wow. All right. That's not it. That's it. Okay. Okay, so since the midterm, we covered quite a bit of topics, not as deeply as I had hoped, but we got through them, sort of. So we started with fiction. And if you remember, this is a Dwayne Michaels sequence called Things Are Queer. And he is queer, by the way. So, you know, he plays with scale, he plays with what our expectations are, you know, when we see objects. And it's kind of, you know, a mind game. It's also, you know, it's, to me, at least, since he's from the 60s, this is from the 60s, it seems a little, you know, druggy, psychedelic, sort of like going inside of things. I talked briefly about conceptual art and this particular piece, this Joseph Kosuth 1 in 3 chairs, where it's, you know, interestingly, it's like a meta picture of a definition of a picture of a chair. But in person, there's an actual physical chair, there's a photograph of the chair, and then there's the dictionary definition of a chair. And so, you know, conceptual art a lot of times had these similar kind of mind games, not similar in the sense that they're like psychedelic or anything, but similar in the sense that the art is really appealing to your intellect more than like visual candy, right? It's not always just meant to be enjoyed for its visual richness, but instead as a kind of, you know, attempt and approach to sort of, you know, make art for the mind rather than, let's say, the eye or the heart. I mentioned Wegman, who's most famous for his videos of his dogs, of many dogs, the Weimaraners. But before he did that, he did a series of conceptual photo pieces like this one. He seems to use milk a lot, I just realized. And then I spoke a bit about Jerry Uelsmann. And, you know, the things that ties all these things together is that they're what I would say, you know, people take pictures and people make pictures. And I think that in this kind of approach to imagery, it's more of a making than a taking. So Jerry Uelsmann, you know, he was my mentor, first of all. And this is his darkroom. He sort of starts in the morning with all of his contact sheets laid out on a table like this, and he just kind of randomly, you know, shuffles them. And then things will sort of visually come together in his mind, and he'll clip a couple of contact sheets together, and then he'll go into the darkroom. And in this darkroom, he has multiple enlargers. He actually has 8 enlargers in his darkroom. These are not digital. I just want to emphasize it's not Photoshop. It's way pre-Photoshop, actually. And so in this case, it was 2 images, one of the tree trunk, the tree roots, and the other of the house. And using 2 separate enlargers with 2 separate negatives in it, he blended them together in the darkroom to create these really believable montages, and that's something I didn't really go into, but there's a real difference between photo montage and photo collage. Montage has at least an attempt to be a believable space. Even if it's only for a few seconds, you go, wow, is that really a house that was on a tree? But we know intellectually that can't be possible, but the illusion is good enough where even for a brief amount of time, we believe it. And that's photo montage. Collage, on the other hand, which we'll sort of end with in this review, that's not the attempt. There's kind of pictures pasted on pictures and things like that. So
I have a question, please.
Yes.
The columns of the house, are they cut from the tree, or is it another picture, or is it original column of the house?
They're the original columns of the house. That was how that old building looked. It's actually easier than you think in black and white to do this, but interestingly, it's not just a straight line that cuts across the image, that he sort of like blended it. So sometimes the tree roots are going up higher onto the porch. Sometimes they're not going up as high on the porch, but it's still a believable kind of image, right? And here's another one. This is the same negative. Look at the background. You'll notice that the mountainscape is symmetrical. So it's the same negative flipped to get both sides. And then the tree, and then in the foreground is this pea pod. And he often uses things like that sort of indicate like life, right? The seeds in there are kind of like going to emerge into our mouths or into life, right? I don't think he's as like conceptual as that. I know he's not actually, but that kind of happens intuitively with a lot of his work. We talk about Baldessari, and we watched that video that Tom Waits had narrated. And this was one of his pieces where he looked at a map of California. It's down at the bottom right. And he looked where the letters that spell the word California are. And then he went to each of those locations. And in those locations, then built out of materials he found there, those letters into that space. And then presented it as a kind of long multi-image panel. He's really much more conceptual. He does a lot of fun things. He uses cameras, he uses photography a lot, but not exclusively. The stickers, if you remember, the dots were kind of the thing that he thinks he'll be most remembered for. We talk about the Starn twins. These are identical twins that work together. Their studio is still in Brooklyn. This is probably one of their most visited pieces. It's in the subway system, and uses the metaphor of the trees and the leaf as a metaphor for a map. So if we see the lines in the leaf in this case, and then the subway lines or the street lines, they're kind of making that analogy that these two things are somehow related. And of course, the very controversial Andre Serrano Piss Christ piece that we talked about, and how it's really about the commercialization of Christianity and not any kind of blasphemy or any kind of criticism of Christianity, but instead the plastic Jesuses that are all around the Vatican. It seemed to him as a practicing Catholic that cheapened his religion. And so that was the point of this. And if you remember, I mentioned that he had been using bodily fluids for years before this particular image came out.
Then, Professor.
Yeah.
Would you say that as like a practicing Catholic, this was his way of saying that our faith has become so cheap?
I don't think so. You can interpret it that way. First of all, it doesn't really matter what an artist thinks they did, right? I mean, his intention is one thing, but the way that we interpret work is often different from the artist's intention, which this is a great example of, by the way. He had one idea, and Jesse Helms and a lot of the very conservative Catholics, interpreted it in the opposite way. It's possible that might have been part of the idea, but I think he's been very specific in a number of lectures about what he was thinking when he made it. And if your interpretation is that, it's not wrong. I just want to make that clear, but I don't think that's what he meant to do. Does that answer your question? Does that answer your question? Okay. I talked about Jeff Wall, who, you know, these are some of the earliest Photoshop montages, and they're still some of the largest, actually. So this is an image about war. As I said, it's not about a specific war. It's just about the futility of young men dying in the dirt for some other cause that's not really theirs, right? Wars are usually started by, you know, politicians and generals, and then they don't risk their lives. It's the 18 to 24-year-old poor kids that die in those wars, and not them. And so, you know, he constructed the ditch in a studio. Each one of the sort of groups, or groups of soldiers that are sort of waking up after they had been killed and realizing the futility of their own deaths, was photographed separately and individually. And then the whole thing was seen together on a Macintosh 2 with 8 megabytes of RAM. Yes, megabytes, not gigabytes. 8 megabytes of RAM and an 80 megabyte hard drive. Megabyte, not gigabyte or terabyte. It was an interesting time with those early Macintosh computers and early Photoshop, version 1 and 2, without layers or anything like that. I talked about Jeff Wall. He did this one. This is something he did fairly early in his work. It was right after he got out of graduate school, he made this one. I showed the image, but I didn't really explain it very well in the original lecture. And I just want to talk about how this is sort of his interpretation of a novel by Ralph Ellison called Invisible Man, which is really about an African-American male who feels like he's invisible to the world, that people refuse to see him. And so all the light bulbs on the ceiling are sort of a symbol to show, that he needs to be seen, that the light should be shined on him, if that makes sense. I'm trying to get to the chat. I see there's some things going on I want to see, so I'm going to open up the chat. Okay. Gregory, which one were you asking about? You're asking about an artist. Who is this artist? Things are clear. Oh, that's Duane Michaels, D-U-A-N-E-M-I-C-H-A-L-S. It's spelled unusually. There's no E, but that's Duane Michaels. 8 megabytes. Yes, it's amazing, isn't it? Figure out you used to do an action in Photoshop, and then you'd go to lunch and come back, and it might still be like churning. All right, so let me keep the chat open so I can see what's going on in it.
Professor, what was the name of the the photographer for the map with the leaf and the tree and the subway?
So those are the Starn twins. There's 2 identical twins, S-T-A-R-N, Starn twins.
Right, thank you.
Jeff Wall and Gregory Crewdson work in a kind of similar way. They construct sort of almost cinematic, almost to the level of movies, images. So again, they're making pictures instead of taking pictures, right? And so Crewdson and Wall sort of emerged about the same time. They also both create very large scale photographs, very intense productions. So here's the final image. And I talked about how this particular project and another one really had sort of been set in suburbia, and the kind of like, I don't know, the idea of suburbia is that it's kind of a utopian middle ground between urban life and rural life. But the actuality for many people of a suburban lifestyle is that it's very isolating, and that often, at least in a traditional family structure, which probably doesn't really exist anymore, but the fictional idea of the man going away to work in the morning, the wife staying at home to do housely duties. They rarely see each other. He comes home exhausted, and she's doesn't, feels very isolated in this house by herself, or even with a kid. And so here's the production level. They got the fire department to come in and make it rain, right? And so this is right after the shoot. And he's sort of like, you can see the sort of afters. It says getting ready, but it's got to be after, because the rain is still falling. So Gregory Crutzen has been able to get like this whole little subdivision to kind of cooperate with his project, and the fire department and the wrecking crews and other kinds of people like that get involved. And of course, the most important, I think, artist of the late 20th century in many, many ways is Cindy Sherman. And Sherman's influence is still, felt. I mean, I think in a way, even both Jeff Wall and Gregory Crutzen owe a lot to her, because these are set up pictures. They're directorial pictures. They're, almost cinematic pictures. They look like a movie. They feel like a movie. There's no you're not attempting to go out with a camera and walk around in the world and hope something interesting happens, but instead, the artist makes something happen, makes a picture instead of takes a picture. Is Gregory Crutzen still considered conceptual art? I think so. There's an idea there. I think classic conceptual art often has a very kind of sterile form to it. It's just an idea, maybe some words that set off an idea, but his work is much more visually rich than, I think, traditional conceptual art, but it still has a concept to it. So to get back to Cindy Sherman, this was a big switch, and I had mentioned, and I'd ask you all to either go or look at the website for the Pictures generation. And she was one of that exhibition at Metro Pictures called Pictures. And sort of all the artists that were in that show, and many of them very influential still, she sort of, came way up out. And I mean, partially this was because of a critic at the New York Times who decided to write about her. His name was Andy Grunberg. He actually has a new book out. And she was able to then sort of respond to his criticism with images, and then he'd write about it more. And there's this dialogue between the artist, the audience, and the critic, which of course is ideal for any artist. You want to be recognized and seen and written about so other people look at you. The sort of genre of the film still is something else that also John Baldessari used. Remember, he had a drawers and drawers full of photo stills from movie stills. Okay, so we talked a little bit about Inka Shonabar, who was one of the so-called YBA artists that came out of England in the 90s. Unfortunately, he's very disabled currently, and he has a degenerative muscular disease. And he's sort of, in a wheelchair and can barely use his hands anymore. But this was a project that he did where he was inverting class and race. And in England in particular, we try to ignore the class here. It's impossible. I mean, it's all there, but we never talk about it in this country. But its underlying class is still there. In England, it's overtly there. And, there is the sort of blue blood upper class twits who sort of run everything still, because they're moneyed and they have money from generations ago. And so this is a kind of inversion of both class and race in that kind of society. He's imagining if people of African descent were the people, the blue bloods, the people with the landed gentry, so to speak, and the lawyers and the judges and the politicians in this image and in this image as well. So all the white people are fawning over him because he's so great. And it's really kind of a great inversion of that idea.
That kind of reminds me of a show right now on Netflix. It's becoming popular. It's really popular now. But it's just sort of a fantasy world of back in those times, you know, during the 1500s, that it's just all, everyone, like all races are just, it's all mixed in, like there's, which was not reality, obviously, but this is what the Netflix show does. Crosses those lines of race.
Is that Bridgerton?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
I love it too. We watched all of it. It's, unfortunately, that main African-American actor is not going to be on next season. It's really disappointing.
Oh, that's a shame.
Yeah, so Michael. We talked about DeCorsia. Remember, these are images called, this project was called Heads. He had set up some strobe lights mounted to like scaffolding in Grand Central, no, not Grand Central, whatever that square is with all the signs that only tourists go to. The books aren't, oh, well, that's too bad. What's that place called?
Times Square.
Times Square, thank you very much. God, like blanked it. So yeah, he set up some strobe lights with a radio control system on his camera in Times Square, which of course is technically like the busiest place in the world. I didn't realize that, but more people cross Times Square per hour than any other place in the world, apparently. And so, you know, it's that idea of the you know, all of us who are city dwellers understand this, I think, where you're walking in an extremely crowded place and yet you're completely inside your head, right? You're so internalized in your head that you're thinking about whatever it is, work, family, lust, hunger, you know, and all that stuff is going on in your head. And even though there's people all around you, you can't even, you know, they're just not there. They're kind of invisible to you. And so, you know, that sort of idea that even though you're in a crowded place, you're all alone at the same time. And then this one, of course, was the sort of image that caused a major lawsuit against him that established a lot of things that were, I think, kind of important. That, first of all, if you're in a public place, the most public place in this case, but any public place, a street, a sidewalk, even if you can be seen from a street or a sidewalk, you have no right to privacy. Why would you think that if you're in public, you have privacy? And that's essentially what the judge ruled. And then there was some other issues about how Crutzen had, DeCorsia, how DeCorsia had profited from this picture and therefore should have had a model release and rights to use this person's image. And the judge dismissed that. And also that the subject of the image had a sort of religious issue with being, you know, portrayed in a graven image, which was against his particular sect's religion. Again, the judge dismissed that. So sort of a three-part suit that has established a lot of, I mean, it was already known, that was already the law, but then this case reinforced that. So after the fiction, we moved on to the street photography. And you know, this is probably the first street photograph, right? To the very first picture of a person in Paris. But you know, I think it's important to start with Cartier-Bresson, you know, and the Leica camera, and this particular book, The Decisive Moment. So, you know, Cartier-Bresson sort of took this camera. This camera, as I mentioned in class, was actually designed to test movie film stock. So 35mm film was actually developed for movies, and they didn't have light meters back then. So they would take a couple of frames with the same film stock that the movie camera is loaded with, quickly process them inside of the back of a van or something, and know whether or not they've got the exposure right to shoot the movie. But kind of quickly after that, a lot of people began to sort of adopt this camera for its own purposes, to make still photographs and not be a tester for movie stock. And I showed you mine. It's very portable and compact. It's way much smaller than any DSLR or even mirrorless cameras are today. Easily fits in your jeans pocket. It's very quiet because it has a cloth shutter. So, people don't even know you're taking a picture often. It's got the best optics of anything ever, hands down, period. Leica lenses are the best lenses ever made and still continue to be. And this is a great example of the decisive moment idea, right? So, Cartier-Bresson sort of, I feel like he's kind of like a hunter, right? He sort of positions himself in a place, sets up all the settings on his camera, which don't have light meters, by the way. So you just have to sort of like understand light. And then he waits until something happens. And he's all ready and he's waiting. And then this man sort of tries to jump over this puddle by using that ladder that's in the puddle. And he stops it at that instant when the heel is about to hit the water and make a big splash and disturb the reflective surface of the water. And so we've got the silhouette of the man, we've got the reflection of the silhouette of the man. And then in the background here, there's this poster on the wall of a dancer that's kind of doing almost the same pose, not exactly, of course, but leaping legs apart that kind of echo this man's leap over the water. And so, Bresson is just kind of like the iconic street photographer in the sense of just being able to get everything just right, exactly, and not just once and not just occasionally, but consistently over 60 years of making pictures. That one little silhouette of the figure in the lower left corner down there, there's a sense of humanity in almost all of his pictures. Lena, no. And I say that because the Leica camera, that one in particular, you have to wind the knob manually to get to the next frame and shoot. And even if you're very good at it, it's a couple of seconds between shots. There wasn't like that continuous shoot that most modern cameras have. There wasn't even motor drives at that point. So he got it in one shot. And, there's, as I was saying, there's kind of sense of humanity in most of his pictures, but he does use silhouettes often. So it's not about an individual person, which if we were to see their face or any of their details, we would identify more with the individual than the rest of the picture. So these silhouettes sort of act as kind of like all people, a human, not an individual person. Helen Levitt here in New York, in the Harlem and in just North Manhattan mostly. She had I mentioned, she also used a Leica. Most of these photographers use Leicas, by the way. Had an attachment on her lens that allows you to sort of shoot sideways. And so all of these pictures of children that seem so natural and so candid are that way because they're not aware they're being photographed, right? Certainly at this time, before the ubiquity of phone cameras, when a camera came out, people noticed it, and especially children would sort of ham it up for the camera. But if you're pointing it in a different direction, even though you're shooting them, they're not aware they're being photographed, so they're in a much more natural kind of state. The sort of like innocence of kids, maybe not so innocent of that pregnant woman looking at the milk and then the two milks on the other girl, but and as I said, when I talked about it, we still see things like this, right? And of course, this is, pre-air conditioning. So much of New York was hanging out outside in the summertime. These apartments were hot, they often didn't have a breeze through the apartment. So windows were open, people hung out outside or right by the window. And kids played in the street. And the other kind of iconic, I think, street photographer, Cartier-Bresson came first, certainly. But when we think about street photography, I think, Robert Frank is right up there with Bresson. And Frank's book, The Americans, which this is the cover of, was a real sort of like really important book, and it still is one of the best, greatest ever photograph, books of photographs. A photo book, I should say. And as you can see, the introduction was by Jack Kerouac, who, just to remind you, was a writer known as a sort of leader of the so-called Beat generation. And the Beats were sort of like pre-hippies. They were, they were appalled by the sort of strictness of 1950s America. And the Beats, there was other poets and writers, and he was part of that group. Kerouac's book On the Road is kind of a similar idea to The Americans, in that Frank, got this grant, a Guggenheim grant, to drive around America and make pictures. And so the On the Road and The Americans have this relationship to each other. But Frank was also, he was born in Switzerland, raised in England. And so when he got to New York, when he got to America, he was really almost like an anthropologist. And the book seems like an anthropological study of mid 20th century America. And race, of course, was a big part of that book, right? The African Americans are at the back of the bus. We've got the uptight and white lady in the front-ish window. We got the innocence of the children in the middle window. And so this is his early work from London, but this is from the book, The Americans. And again, the sort of on the road feeling, the Jack Kerouac kind of like, let's take a journey. Their favorite pastime of choice were barbiturates, so they used a lot of speed. And actually, the manuscript to Jack Kerouac's book is one single roll of yellow paper that he just wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. This is an image of his wife and his son. As I mentioned, he just came home one day and said, "Hi, honey, get in the car. We're going for a drive. I got a grant." And so they packed up the car and drove. The first one was sort of straight west, from New York, kind of going randomly westward. And then the second trip was straight down south. So the book really had a couple of themes. Race was one of them, certainly. And religion was another one. Remember, this is a televangelist sort of preaching to nobody. The flag was another sort of recurring iconic imagery in the book, and that sort of stood in for patriotism, or in this case, blind patriotism. So, I mean, the book is it's heavily critical of American society in the mid 1950s. And I think accurately, because it was a really shallow time for the country, but a lot of people look back on it, the good old days, but it was only the good old days for a very small part of the public. No, it hasn't really changed that much, you're right. But he was able to visualize it, right? He was able to sort of make it clear what, the country's like. look at the whole book. It's amazing. It really is. Ouija, who I think is, to me, like the quintessential New York City photographer certainly of that era before New York had been gentrified. He, remember, had an illegal police band radio in his trunk, and he was able then to sort of listen in on to what the police were saying. There's been a shooting on, Mulberry Street between this and that block. And oftentimes he would get there before the cops did. And so they thought he had a Ouija board. They thought he was able to predict the future with his Ouija board. So that's what he sort of took that name. It's not spelled the way a Ouija board is spelled, but his real name was Arthur Fellig. But on the back of all of his prints, he had a rubber stamp that said Ouija the Famous. And he stamped the backs of all of his pictures with that rubber stamp, and it just, that sort of moniker kind of stuck. And he became the Famous by just saying it over and over again. This is a scene that there's a scene in the Godfather movies of a sort of shooting in an Italian restaurant in Little Italy. And this is what it was based on. This was an actual massacre of an Italian gang in Little Italy in an Italian restaurant. His pictures are gritty. They're dark. He uses on-camera flash, which gives them this kind of like, very stark contrast, and often they're made at night. So, the imagery sort of just really falls off to blackness outside of the flash area. Another sort of iconic street photographer, especially of New York City, is Bruce Davidson. And Bruce, most famously, his first book, East 100th Street, was made, I can't remember, somebody found out last week, in the mid 50s or early 60s, I believe. But, as I said, he sort of started going to this block months and months, if not a year, before he brought a camera. And so he started hanging out at the shops and at the coffee shop or wherever people hang out, maybe on the street in the summertime especially. And he got to know some of the people in the neighborhood. And then he started bringing his camera. And since people already knew him, they were more comfortable with that idea. And then ultimately, over the next couple of years, actually, he was able to sort of photograph the people that lived on this block and their lives. So the flag again is in this one, but I don't think it's as critical, that as Frank might have been. But he did sort of give the people dignity, and I think that's important. That he'd asked this man a couple of times. I told this story before, but can I come to your home and photograph you and your family? And he was really hesitant and reluctant. And then finally he said, only if you let me tell you what to photograph, don't shoot anything without my permission. And so when he got there, they all had their best clothes on, and he was very proud of this picture of his wedding with his wife in her wedding gown, and the TV, which to us is not such a big deal, but then was a real symbol of like wealth. And not everybody could afford a TV. It was a very expensive item at that time. It was still kind of new, and especially a big one like that. That's actually quite large for that time. Nice curtains, they all got their hair done. And so he made this beautiful picture of this lovely family, and just sort of the people that he got to know there. As I said, I know Bruce, he's such a kind man, and he's so friendly that people just like, he's so likable. You can't not like him. And this was his second book. East 100th Street was first, and then Brooklyn Gang, which, as I mentioned, these are people he grew up with and knew them in high school, was actually invited to be part of this so-called gang. And at the time, this book looked so looked like these people were so dangerous and scary, and oh my God, they've got tattoos and smoke cigarettes, and even the girls are doing their hair in front of this. It just looks so innocent now, but at the time it didn't. And
His photographs of the Brooklyn gang remind me of this cartoonist from the 70s called Ralph Bakshi or Bakshi. And he did a cartoon movie with called Hey Good Looking. And it's very similar to all these pictures, especially the girl in the photograph with the cigarette machine. There's actually a shot exactly like that.
I love him. He did a great movie called Wizards. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's really wonderful.
I heard of it, but I haven't seen it.
And he did a not so good job with the Lord of the Rings that didn't quite.
But I wouldn't doubt that he was influenced by some of these photographs. That's just the impression I.
He probably saw them, absolutely. And another really well-known book of Bruce is the Subway book. And so he, rode the subway back and forth and photographed what it looked like at that time. This is probably in the 70s. And, a lot of it looks the same. But again, I would sort of like remind you that there was no air conditioning in the subway until much after these pictures. It was hot. It was, uncomfortable to be down there. And everything was graffitied and everything had, tags and marks all over it. And we talked briefly about the guardian angels and how there's kind of a resurgence of them, and how they would sort of try to keep the subway safe, but in some cases they were actually the instigators of fights themselves. And then I mentioned this one where these two guys are friends, actually they're buddies, and once the guy on the left saw Bruce's camera come out, he whipped his gun out and pointed it at his friend's head. Just for the photograph, I want to, like, this isn't like he didn't catch a murder or anything, but they sort of play acted this, and you can see that the guy on the right is really like, what the fuck are you doing, man? I don't, like scared actually. And so Metzger was working in Chicago, and so the thing about Metzger that I've always liked is the really high contrast, stark black and whiteness. There's not a lot of subtle middle grays in his pictures. There's a kind of light, it happens in New York in the winter, it happens in Chicago as well, where it's that really cold day and the sky is blue, there's not a cloud in it, and the sun just seems to be so bright. And so everything is, in shadow. The shadows are much darker and much blacker than in other days when, let's say it's in the summer and there's clouds over the sky where everything's kind of all evenly illuminated. So he has a sense of humor as well. The really graphic sensibility, I think, is part of that black and white thing in his pictures. Some of this actually is enhanced by the way he would process the film and make the prints, by the way. But and another street photographer that we talked about briefly is Elliot Erwitt. And Erwitt, he's really, I think, the funniest of them all. He did this book about dogs, right? But let me go back to this picture. And I didn't tell this story in the first lecture, but I think it's important to sort of understand, like, he shot this 20 years or more before he printed it. He, decided to go back and look through his old negatives and his old contact sheets at some point. And then he found this picture in his contact sheet from decades before. And it's become one of his most important pictures, most recognized pictures that he's ever made. And it's interesting how that can happen. And we talk, I talk a little bit about this in the digital age, where we shoot so many pictures, we ultimately delete a lot of them because we need more room on our hard drive or something. And so, negatives don't get deleted, at least not as often as digital files do. So that idea that he sort of went back over, decades later and found this image, and then it became like an icon of his work. Is interesting. He did fashion. He did a lot of commercial work. He's very personable as well. Had a sense of humor. This is the dog's book. That's really funny to me. And then the two sort of 70s era street photographers that ended up having a show at the Museum of Modern Art that John Zarkowski made were Winogrand and the other guy who's not in here, so it doesn't matter. But you can see Winogrand's Leica there, right? This is his camera of choice. So many of these people, they liked that camera because it was small, it was quiet, and it was very, very good. This is a great quote. I'm going to ask you about this on the exam, so just remember this. I photograph to see what the world looks like in photographs. And so when people ask artists, people ask photographers, why do you make things? It's always some kind of convoluted, I don't know, bullshit, mostly. I don't know, maybe not mostly, but some. And so, yes, Arbus was part of that show. And yes, also making books really is an important way to get your work seen and out there. But anyways, this idea that, it's such a simple thing, like, I don't know what and it's very true, because what we see with our eyes and our brain, we see the physical aspect of it, and then our brain does the interpretive aspect of what we see, is very different than how a camera sees the world. And so, that idea that the camera kind of changes what we see is important to sort of think about. And he was very reluctant to do lectures. He didn't want to be interviewed from art magazines or anything. He was just a kind of like iconoclastic. He's kind of an asshole, actually, but that's fine, right? It sort of takes that kind of aggressiveness to be a street photographer in a lot of ways. Don't care what people think of me. I'm going to shove a camera in their face, whether they like it or not. He often shot from the hip, so to speak, meaning he doesn't always look through the viewfinder of the camera and would simply kind of hold it out in front of him, point and shoot. So a lot of times there's this kind of off kilter horizon line that gives the pictures a kind of energy that if it was a straight horizon line might not be as visually interesting. Like diagonal lines in photographs do tend to make more interesting compositions, more active, dynamic compositions.
Why was that man randomly on the floor in that other picture?
He's disabled. I think he's lost his legs. Right?
Oh, okay.
And, the image I think is about how there's this man on the ground and all these other people, mostly men.
And they're indifferent.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like walking by, literally looking up at the sky, or just completely ignoring this disabled person on the street. I left too many of these in. I didn't mean to do this. So let me just check how many I left in here. I was trying to cull it way down, and that's way too many. So yeah, I don't need all of these. I'm going to delete the rest of these.
So with this review, the final is going to be next week on the 20th, right?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It will mostly be based on this review, okay? So, that. So another street photographer that was of note, maybe not as important for her own pictures, but for her teaching at the New School, was Lisette Model. And so she was Diane Arbus's teacher most famously. And you can see Arbus, I think, in these pictures. You can also see how influenced she was by Robert Frank, for example. She really, like this quote here, "Don't shoot until you feel it in your gut." You know, that's kind of like a lot of street photographers want to use a wide angle lens and get in your face. Like, instead of using a long telephoto lens where they can be across the street and take pictures and you don't know it, this idea that you have to be close to your subject by using a wide angle lens, and much like phones, actually, because, you know, if you're 10 feet away from somebody and you take a phone picture, they're tiny. So, you know, a lot of people used wide angle lenses and got up and in your face kind of thing. And then that's, I think, what the quote there is a little bit about. But I'd mentioned in the lecture that, in my opinion, I think she was very cruel, perhaps appropriately. This is this fat politician at a fundraiser. So she's kind of poking fun at the obese politician. Of course, you know, body shaming is not something we do anymore. And so her pictures were also close up, right? She got close in right on the people. They were clearly aware she was right there. There's no, you know, denying that they knew they were being photographed. And then most, you know, as I mentioned, most famously, her student was Diane Arbus. And I think if you look at Arbus's work and you look at Lisette Model's work, you can see the influence on her. I don't think Arbus was as cruel. I think she was much more sympathetic to her subjects. But this is one of the, you know, more well-known images by Arbus, these two twins. But the more you look at their faces, the more different they actually are. It seems like the girl on our right is the optimist and the girl on our left is the pessimist, but I could be just interpreting it that way. I'm not sort of saying that's true, but so she photographed outsiders. I had mentioned that she, you know, her family was wealthy. She grew up the daughter of a family that owned a department store. They had trained her to hopefully make photographs for the store. So she learned very early, you know, earlier than 15, how to use a camera, how to make proper pictures, exposures, etc. And she did do some fashion work. She worked for Vogue. Really looks like Diane Arbus if you look at the Vogue pictures. She did some product work for her family, but that's not really important. She married an actor who was actually on MASH in the 70s, if anybody remembers that show. He was the psychiatrist on MASH, which is interesting. And then ultimately they divorced, and she took some classes down at the New School with Lisette Model. She moved into a building in the West Village that it's an artist's building, and there's a darkroom in the basement. So she was able to use that to make her work. And then she got a job working at the New School so she could use the darkroom there as well. Yeah, Leora, it's mostly about the second half. Another one of her really well-known images, you know, looking at the contact sheet of this, she gets 12 frames from her medium format camera for each roll of film. And the other 11 frames, this kid looks perfectly normal, spoiled, rich kid in Central Park. And then in this one image of him like totally freaking out with a hand grenade in his hand, it's just kind of perfect. You know, the Jewish giant at home is another one of the iconic images of, you know, the older she got, the more interested in people who were different, who were born different, not different through other reasons, but different because they were born that way. The sad king and queen of the dance at this retirement home. And then this series of mentally disabled folks at a facility upstate that, you know, I mentioned that she had just been to a Halloween party and had a box full of these costumes and masks in the back of her car. One of the people saw that box and wanted to play with it. So the whole box comes out and all of the inmates kind of put on costumes and masks. But she had really not wanted this work published. And so after she committed suicide on the day of her opening at the Museum of Modern Art, her children, two daughters, well, one of the daughters at least published these pictures. Yeah, that gives me the creeps too. What movie are we talking? What are we basing the movie on? French movie?
There was a French movie about people in asylum that take over a village for 24 hours and the masks. I don't remember the
I
name.
haven't seen it. I don't know. Yeah, I mentioned this man whose name I'm not going to try to pronounce because he actually went by Art Slut, which I think is such a great name. You know, he grew up in Queens. He's not Chinese, but he found this Mao Zedong suit in a thrift store. And yes, Cole, I agree. You know, he found this suit in a thrift store and sort of put it on, and it just transformed him into this stereotype. I mean, this is really a horrible stereotype of a kind of Asian, with the, you know, quotes around that, tourist. And so he mimicked that kind of photographic style. Primarily the difference in snapshots from Asia, at least at the time, and Americans or Western Europeans as well, is the people don't smile, that the subjects often are very serious because it's it's an important thing. You're taking a picture, you should be serious. Whereas most Westerners like put on this grin, like, hey, it's cheese, yay. And so, he sort of exploited that, that stereotype, which, it's an interesting thing because he's of course Asian. So not that he was born in China, but his parents immigrated to Queens and he was born here. So cultural exploration of his own past, maybe. Also doing the cliched snapshots, right? So Disney World, going to Kennedy Space Center. These are pictures that have already been made, right? They are cliche photographs. And this was at the time when postmodernism was sort of at its height. And so one of the tenets of postmodernism is that everything has already been done. There's no such thing as originality. And so he's kind of playing with that idea as well.
So you said that his parents emigrated to the States, but he was born and raised here?
Yes.
So would you say like this process, like, yes, he's making fun of it, but someone could also interpret it's like a native lost in his own land?
Possibly. I mean, I think it's interesting that he's gone to these two places, which are iconic American places, but he also goes to, he did some in front of Notre Dame and other countries. So it's not necessarily about just being lost in America, but maybe it is about an identity issue of some kind. And identity is another thing that's been very popular in visual art in the past 50 years or so. He died of AIDS, unfortunately. He was actually, I'm going to say Pop Shop, the street artist who would draw in the subway. Kenny, not Kenny Scharf. Anyways. So then Eggleston. So Eggleston was the first photographer to be recognized, at least by the art community, meaning MoMA at the time, color photographer. And so, again, he's a Leica photographer, and I should show it, but he's got a suitcase full of Leicas. But he was shooting Kodachrome color film, and Kodachrome had a very bright, vibrant color palette. It was, there's a song, it's like, it looks like a sunny day. And prior to this, serious photographers used black and white, and only amateurs used color. That was for snapshots. and like portraits in a like tacky portrait studio in the mall or someplace. But his use of color sort of got recognized, and color began to become acceptable in art photography through his work. And there's also the sort of banality of the photographs. I think that they're pictures of every day, although they look very exotic to most of us because they're, yes, that's Eggleston. I'm sorry, Vanessa. They're pictures of his world, of his life in Tennessee, in the 60s in this case. So, very graphic use of color. This was one of the very first pictures. He talks about this sometimes as this was the day he realized that color could be used in an important way. This sort of young man in the golden hour sunlight in the evening in the summer, taking the shopping carts back in from the parking lot. And I think one of the most fun of them all is Jamel Shabazz. And I mentioned that he had a sort of public art installation up at the Rockefeller Center right now. But again, he's a guy who photographed what he knew, what was around him all the time. It happened to be a really wonderful time in a wonderful place. That's him with his Nikon and his glasses and his necklace and all the accessories except the hat. Didn't have the Kangol hat, but so he was just shooting the Bronx and the people he knew in the Bronx, and maybe not even know, but and to me it's kind of amazing how much the people posed. Like this is really like they're doing a pose. And I don't know if he directed it or not, but it seems like most of these people just sort of knew that this was the way to stand if you're going to be photographed.
That always got on my nerves.
Yeah, that posing?
I mean, the people still do it to this day, but
right.
It's like, like one gets down on the floor, all this side, or they're flashing their fingers, something like that. It's
the crossed arm pose.
Yeah, it's so silly.
Yeah.
It's so iconic, yet it just feels so weird to it's so weird to see.
Yeah, sometimes like recent history it feels uncomfortable, I think, especially for people who kind of were around at the time. He's getting a lot more attention now than he ever did when he made the pictures, which I think is kind of interesting. But I certainly remember this time. I remember the dolphin shorts. I remember the hair. I remember the really short shorts for men. The tank tops and all that stuff. That's so great, though. I know that it might annoy you, but just the fact that like these look like 14-year-old boys, like we're gonna do this pose. And there's the hats. So awesome.
What's so great is that it's not even planned, it just happens. Like Carl Jung just said, it's part of the culture. It just happens, and they strike the pose perfectly.
Right.
They're about to do a photo op for a boy band.
There's also kind of braveness, I think, that Jamel Shabazz has to do this. I've been teaching photography for almost 30 years now, and very few people are willing to go out on the street and point a camera at people they don't know, and especially here in New York. And I think that there's a small percentage of people who have the guts to do that, and the ones that do it, I think, get amazing pictures sometimes. He's also a good photographer. I mean, I have to say that, I mentioned Honey, the Humans of New York, and how it's an interesting project, but the photography is not that great, right? but I think that Shabazz just is a good photographer. You know, the neighborhood is visible in the background, but it's soft enough where we're not distracted by it. The trees behind these guys have fallen out of focus enough where we really concentrate on their faces, and the light and the exposure and all of the pictures is just perfect. And it's got this wonderfully vibrant color. Like the way the color in these pictures is working is just fantastic. So that's why I say he's a good photographer, if you were going to ask that. But
I have a comment that it seems that people there are conscious that they're marking a moment in time, like time stops for a second and they make it more eternal. Like the people in the 19th century that will stand very stiff, it's the same, only they move in different gestures, but it's the same, like making this moment becomes eternal, and we are conscious of it, and we project our image, the image we want to project. So it's interesting the way they help the composition and the photo.
well, I think that's true. When this is pre-camera phones, and I think it's important to say that, because what you're saying there, Leora, is kind of like pictures were much more important then, right? People weren't taking 100 iPhone snapshots every day and posting them on their Instagram with billions of photographs coming up every day on Instagram. Photography had more value, it had more weight. So if somebody like he looks like with a serious camera, right? He looks like a photographer, right? He's not that's not a snapshot camera. That's not like a Kodak Instamatic or anything. That's a real professional camera. And so when people would see that, at least in the 70s and the 80s, the early 80s, well, maybe the whole 80s, that was an important moment, as you were saying, right? It was much more serious than now with the ubiquity of camera phones. So yeah, so I think people really did realize, like, oh, okay, this is a moment. This is an important moment, and this guy looks serious because he's got a real camera, so to speak. So people took it seriously. There's also a sense of joy, though. It always gets these people, they just naturally look fucking happy, right? I mean, I don't think you can force that in a photograph. So the guy in the top left, he's just loving it, right? Yes, somebody said Boogie's kind of scary. I do agree with that. Gregory, Boogie's too dangerous. I did to actually take out some of the like shooting up shots because I couldn't take it either. His yeah, guns. Anonymous African-American guy with a gun pointed right at you. It's a stereotype, but it's also, I mean, that looks scary as fuck, right? If you had somebody do that. A lot of, he works internationally, by the way. He's not only in New York, he's actually, from, I forget where he's from, but this book about Sao Paulo was very graphic. And yeah, scary stuff. So the next block that I talked about was the modernism and the avant-garde, and I briefly mentioned the Futurist Manifesto. The raging broom of madness swept us out of ourselves and drove us through the streets as rough and deep as the bed of torrents. Here and there, sick lamplight windows glass taught us to distrust the deceitful mathematics of our perishing eyes. I cried, the scent alone is enough for our beasts. And like young lions, we ran after death, its dark pelt blotched with pale crosses as it escaped down the vast, violent, living and throbbing sky. We had no ideal mistress raising her divine form to the clouds, nor any cruel queen to whom to offer our bodies, etc., etc. And so, this was kind of the one of the many isms in modernism. It is also, I have to be very clear that, the futurists went very quickly into fascism, and like within 2 or 3 years, they embraced Mussolini, and it was very bad. But one of the most famous members, of course, is Duchamp, which we'll talk a little bit more later. This painting called Nude Descending a Staircase, it's not photography, but it is based on the idea of a multiple exposure or a long exposure photograph. And photography influenced futurism heavily. And one of the most important kind of avant-garde schools, if you will, was the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus had 3 iterations, they ran from Germany to escape the rise of the Nazis, and settled in Chicago, many of them. I don't want to talk much about it because it's really a whole 3-hour lecture or even more. They were so influential, but there was a lot of experimentation going on. Let me just say that. So within the Bauhaus, there was a couple of photographers who taught more students. And so the idea of experimental photography, they really encouraged that. And surrealism was sort of another ism of that early 20th century sort of cascade of different schools. And this is a Philippe Halsman photograph of Dali with cats and water and chair and him flying and bouncing and etc. And then I talked a little bit briefly about Lartigue, and this is a young photographer. He did probably most of his important work when he was under 18. He'd been given a camera for a birthday present, and he had this really wacky family. And so, he kind of used fast shutter speeds. His camera that he was given, it was a Kodak Brownie actually, but it had a very fast shutter speed. So he's able to freeze a lot of motion, a lot of action. And I think that's kind of the thing that he's really known for, is these kind of crazy stunt photos where, and these are all like his sisters and cousins and mother and father and friends. So you can see that the use of the fast shutter speed here, with the kid diving, or the tennis player with the ball frozen in the air, or the dog being chucked across the stream or whatever that is, guy jumping down, and his sister falling out of the that weird little buggy. It's kind of innocent and kid-like and just playful. And I think that that's why he was able to make such fun pictures when he was young. It's not that he didn't keep making photographs for the rest of his life, but he's certainly best known for this early work of the kind of spontaneity and, as I said, playfulness of it. And so another one of the so-called isms without an ism at the end is Dada. And here's the ding dong daddy of Dada, Marcel Duchamp. And so Duchamp did a lot of different things, but he did play with photography some. He did a number of sort of playful self-portraits, and the sort of one at the top right, so to speak, of him from a variety of angles, with using a multiple exposure feature in his camera. He sort of made his own image into almost like a brand, if you will. And of course, his famous Rose c'est la vie self-portrait as his alternate female identity. And then the look picture, which he did with the Mona Lisa. And the last big project he did was this one at the Philadelphia, the Museum of Art. An installation, so to speak. He said he quit making art and only played chess, but he still made art, even though he didn't show it to the public. The bottom picture is him playing chess with a nude and his large glass is behind them, and some of his other sculptural objects. And so his BFF, they were very good friends, was Man Ray. So Man Ray and Duchamp sort of worked together on a lot of projects, actually. Man Ray was born in Brooklyn. He was American, had, I can never remember his name, but Man Ray is an invented identity. He thought his name sounded too Jewish to make it to be popular. So he changed it to Man Ray. And this image of the woman with the F clefs is one of his better known ones. Here he is in his all of his multiple identities throughout time. Another very famous image of his is this one, the glass, the tears that look like tears, those are glass beads. It's been recreated by so many artists. And this is Kiki de Montparnasse, a model, a dancer, etc. She also worked with Picasso, by the way, and many other artists in Paris at the time, and this African mask. So during that area, 1930s-ish era, a lot of artists, including Picasso, were exploring African art and integrating it into their own Western European and American imagery. This mask was likely stolen from the Louvre and then put back. The Louvre at the time was a great novel about this, you know, Picasso probably stole a lot of art from the Louvre, but he never got caught. And there's this book about it. It's fantastic. I can't remember the name, but the guards would, there weren't many guards, first of all, in the Louvre. It was not air conditioned, as I keep reminding people. And so a lot of times they'd go to lunch, have a couple glasses of wine at lunch, and they'd come back and they'd sit on their stool and fall asleep in the corner. And so there's like art everywhere that people just pick up and walk out with. And it happened a lot. And a lot of times artists would just borrow it for a couple of months and then bring it back. It's kind of an interesting thing. So actually the Mona Lisa was stolen from the Louvre about this time. And the rumor is that it was Picasso that did it. So, but this is Kiki in another model. That's Kiki again. His self-portrait, another self-portrait. And of course, one of the best known things he ever did was this idea of solarization, where if you sort of interrupt the developing process of a print and then flash it with white light and then continue to develop it, you get this kind of half positive, half negative image with what we call Mackie lines, which is like if you look at her nose, lips, and chin, you can see that extra dark black line around them. That's from solarization. And this is a picture of Lee Miller that Man Ray made. Now, Lee Miller, we're going to look at next, but she was an American who came to Paris, which many young Americans did. You know, a lot of people. And Man Ray was kind of this link between New York and Paris at the time. And so a lot of young wannabe artists, wannabe photographers would come and work for him. And what working for a photographer at that time meant was doing the darkroom work, loading the cameras, if you're a studio photographer, setting up the lights and stuff like that. And so Lee Miller was in the darkroom printing. The story goes that at some point she felt a mouse run over her foot and she freaked out and she turned on the light and screamed. Man Ray came running into the darkroom and said, "What are you doing?" and flipped off the light again. And so then the print that was in the developer at that time solarized. And that's how they figured this out. It was just a total accident that they then were able to reproduce and get much more control over time. And so, you know, it's an interesting kind of, you know, solarized look, kind of almost like a drawing sometimes. And this is Man Ray's portrait of Duchamp's large glass, which sat in his apartment on 10th Street between 1st and 2nd Avenue, which is a couple blocks from my house, or my apartment, for years untouched and gathered dust. And then Man Ray saw it one day and thought how beautiful the dust on the large glass is. And so he made this photograph of the dusty large glass. And so here's Lee Miller. Now, I just mentioned that she had come to Paris to sort of intern or assist Man Ray. And prior to her doing that, she'd been a model. Beautiful young woman. She'd modeled for all the big magazines, Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, which was the most important one at the time, and other kind of famous fashion magazines. So here's actually Man Ray's picture of her, which then she solarized in the darkroom, because actually a lot of people believe she was the person who really perfected that technique, even though, of course, Man Ray gets the credit for it. But since she was A, a woman, and B, his assistant, he was the male photographer, so he got the credit for it. They were lovers, they were friends. She, as I mentioned before, was the correspondent, you can see it, war correspondent on the left there, for Vogue magazine and during World War II. So after she had worked with Man Ray for a while, she went off on her own to become a photographer. And so then there's this really iconic image, right? And I mentioned in class that, she had been photographing Paris during the bombings and stuff. And then she was in so-called embedded, which they call it now, with a troop of army soldiers that went to Berlin at the very end of the war to find Hitler and to take him to justice, right? Hitler committed suicide in a bunker somewhere, but they'd gone to his apartment first, and they knocked on the door. Hey, Hitler, you there? No. So then they broke down the door and they went in. And so this is her in Hitler's bathtub taking a bath, quite the selfie, right? Because she'd been embedded with these dudes for weeks and hadn't had a bath, and it was filthy. So she saw a bathtub and she jumped in it. And there's that picture of Hitler on the left that she placed there just to make people know that that's where she is. And there's her combat boots on the ground in front of her. It's kind of cropped, but in most of the pictures you can see those are her combat boots. These are some of her pictures of war that she sent back to American Vogue. Destruction, the bombing, she's a badass, man. She's a badass. So I talked a bit about Hannah Hawk, who was part of the Dada movement. You can see in the lower right corner, Dada is there. And Dada is in the upper left corner as well. Only sort of, I have to say, it's very clear that most of these movements, these isms, were completely male dominated. There were very few women included or even accepted into those sort of inner circles in that 20th century time period. And she was one of the few that were actually actively in the Dada group. And so it's an odd thing because Dada is as everything and everywhere and nowhere. And it's just, it's cool. It's wonderful. It's really great. But it's also there wasn't a clubhouse they all went to meet at or something, right? They didn't have a bar in Paris where every Thursday night they would get together. Or in New York during the abstract expressionist painting years, they wouldn't go. There wasn't the Cedar Tavern the Abex painters would go to and drink till they were blind. It was just a sort of loose group of people who liked the idea of Dada, and she was one of them. Now, this is collage. I had mentioned with Jerry Uelsman that he's more montage, right? So montage, remember, is kind of the idea of making an image from multiple images, but it's kind of believable. You can enter the space of a Jerry Uelsman picture and believe briefly that could be real. That's not the case with collage. There's no attempt to make a realistic space or any kind of use perspective or any kind of, attempt at making a believable entry into the work. And if anything, it sort of enforces the flatness of the page. One of the unfortunate things about Hannah Hawk's work, we don't have a lot of it because it was all like cut from popular magazines and newspapers and pasted onto board somehow. Those reproductions in like newspapers especially, but magazines as well, were not printed to be kept for 100 years or anything. They were meant to be read once and thrown away. So there's a lot of acid in the paper, and that acid sort of like eats the image up from the inside ultimately. So a lot of her work is really quickly like fading in color, but she was cool. Moholy-Nagy was a part of the Bauhaus movement. He's kind of my art grandfather. My undergraduate professor studied with Moholy-Nagy, so that I have a link to him too. And his this quote, remember this quote, it will be on the test. The illiterate of the future will be the person ignorant of the use of the camera as well as the pen. So, when I say, who said the illiterate of the future will be, you'll say, Moholy-Nagy did that, right? And I think it's very obviously true right now. The internet is more about images than it is about words. And if we think about our current culture, it's all about the image, very little about the pen, so to speak. I mean, we emphasize the writing in academic circles, and it's important, and of course novels and other things are really still around and still active. But if we look at popular culture especially, you can see how the photograph becomes the dominant form.
Does it mean that they are not ignorant? I mean, most of the photos are ignorant.
Yes, and yes, but that's part of it. And if you can recognize that, can see that yes, this is just a snapshot of a birthday of a 12-year-old, then that's part of that being literate about photography, right? If you can look at a book or an article or anything written down, part of being literate about that is understanding that there's good and bad, that there's things that are aimed at certain audiences, that and so I think that's what literate means. These are some of his photo collages. He had a big show at the Guggenheim a couple of years ago. It was fantastic, and it really allowed me to figure out what he was doing. So a lot of the stuff would be his own photographs, cut and pasted and collage it, and then he would photograph that collage and then collage on top of that, and then photograph that second collage and then collage on top of that. So it's a really sort of interesting combination of multiple photographic techniques to get these very graphic, very Bauhaus kinds of images. Another emphasis on the flatness of the plane, right? So this was big part of, late modernism, that there was no longer a kind of perspective to enter into in many artworks, but instead it was all on the surface, the flatness of the image.
Can I just say something, that if you mentioned Bauhaus, and Bauhaus was modernist in the sense that there was no weight. They could make buildings with less weight. In the corner, they could do it without a column structurally. And his pictures, they are also like floating, like something is against gravity. So in this sense, he is Bauhaus too.
Yes, very much. And he studied and taught at the Bauhaus and very much, applied the ideas of Bauhaus to all of his work, really. His wife was also a great photographer for that. Schwitters is kind of the best known of the collage artists. We can see in the upper left corner here a Man Ray image that he used. You can see on the right side a Moholy-Nagy image that's used in this collage. And again, there's really no sense of entering into this space. These are all kind of pictures on the surface. Often collage artists would, Dada collage artists would include text and type and things like that. So, John Hartfield was a very brave artist who, during the rise of Nazism, published a magazine that he often made the cover images for, that was politically, anti-Nazi. I mean, it's not hard to understand that now, but at the time, doing that in Germany was a very dangerous thing. It was sort of, this was a violent political movement. And so he was heavily critical of the rise of Nazism. And you can see in this image on the right, this is a collage he did of Superman eating the coin of the realm, right? So all the money, the taxes that people are paying are not going to like feed the poor and make the streets and, build new libraries, but instead, Hitler himself is taking all the taxes, all the money, and ingesting it for his own purposes, which is war, right? He's building war machines, training soldiers, etc. And here's—
Was that a photo or it looked like a painting?
It's a photo collage.
Photo collage, okay.
It's almost a montage in the sense that it kind of looks like it's real, but it's cut and paste with scissors and glue. There was no Photoshop, right? And so this was all done with a razor blade probably, and hot wax is what we used to use to do this kind of thing. Here's another one about the people that are just sort of feeding money to him secretly to the war effort. Goering was one of the most violent of the German generals that Hitler had given power to, and so we can see him as a butcher with the axe and blood all over him. There's no question that these are politically pointed anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler images, and they're he died because of this. They came and got him. I can't be sure of that, but that's what the story that I remember was. At a certain point, he was executed for doing this. So don't quote me on that. That won't be on the test, but that's, I think, what happened. So yes, it does look great, doesn't it? I mean, there's a lot more of them, and they're all really like believable. In the way he combined different images. So I mentioned Van der Zee. He was the kind of the best known portrait photographer in Haarlem for a number of years, decades, I should say. So this is a montage of a funeral of this girl that you can see floating above it. So he's sort of made this picture for the family of the girl who died, and she's kind of watching over her own funeral, if you will. And another one, it's kind of this idea of we talked about spirit photography and ghosts and things like that in one of the first lectures, months ago, but he's using those same techniques that those spirit photographers had done. Multiple exposure, combined printing in the darkroom, etc. Oh, he lived at 68. Thank you. So I was dead wrong about that. I guess he got away. And then I'm going to end on this one. We've been talking about collage and modernism. So this is kind of the first so-called pop art pieces. Pop art is often considered to be an American phenomenon that even might have been invented by, say, Andy Warhol. But that's absolutely not true. Richard Hamilton was English. He lived in London. He started making these kinds of collages with imagery from popular media, not that different than the Dada artists, we just saw. But somehow this got its own sort of moniker known as pop art. And it's really focusing on the kind of the magazines at the time that were aimed at oftentimes at women, like, how to keep the house clean, how to please your husband, and all these ridiculous articles that were being written at that time. And so we see the vacuum cleaner going up the stairs, and how great that one is, because ordinary cleaners only reach this far, but she's got it all the way to the top of the stairs. Isn't that wonderful? How great this can of ham would be with television and sex and all these kind of other indicators of popular culture in 1968. And I want to make that clear because it was 1968. So, those indicators are not current, but at the time, that was what you would be seeing in magazines and popular culture. All right, so there we go. It's almost 1 o'clock. Let's take our break now. I haven't eaten yet. I'm sure you guys haven't, although you might have, because you can turn your cameras off. But I want to have 15 minutes. So at 1, let's say 15, we're going to start again, and then we'll go with gas stove. Yes. Box with 2. Oh, that's a tape. A box on the ground is a tape recorder, which was the latest and greatest way to record music or record sound. You could talk to it. Yes, a reel-to-reel, that's right, a reel-to-reel tape recorder. And that was before the cassette, because the cassette enclosed the 2 reels. And it was before the 8-track tapes, which were, even more kludgy than that. Oh, it's 1956, not 68. I was totally wrong about that. Jeez. It's the predecessor to the cassette player, absolutely. All right, so I'll see you all at 1:15.